Chapter 12, Mishnah 2. In order for the sprinkling to be valid, the mechatas must reach the tamei person or utensil from the esav and not from some other object. The first part of this Mishnah teaches the law in cases where it is not clear whether the drops of mechatas that fell on the person or utensil came from the esav or from something else. The Mishnah discusses three different uncertainties. It starts with the case discussed in the previous Mishnah, where a short esav was made longer by tying it with a thread to a spindle. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. If someone sprinkled mechatas with an esav that was tied to a spindle, and it is uncertain whether the drop of mechatas that landed on the tamei person or utensil came from the thread, from the spindle, or from the esav stalk, his sprinkling is not valid and the person or utensil remains tamei. In the previous case, the question was whether the drop that fell on the person or utensil came from the esav or from something else. In this next case, the drop certainly came from the esav, but the question is whether it fell directly from the esav onto the utensil. If someone sprinkled mechatas on two tamei utensils at the same time, and it is uncertain whether he sprinkled on both of them directly or whether the mechatas first fell on one of them and then dripped from that on one onto the other, his sprinkling is not valid. In order to make a utensil tahor, the mechatas must fall directly from the esav onto the utensil. If it falls first on one utensil and then dips from there onto another utensil, the second utensil does not become tahor. Since we do not know what happened, the second utensil remains tamei. In the previous case, both utensils were tamei and in need of sprinkling. In the next case, only one of the two utensils needed sprinkling. If a tamei needle was placed on a piece of earthenware and someone sprinkled mechatas on it, it is uncertain whether he sprinkled directly onto the needle or whether the mechatas first fell on the piece of earthenware and then dripped from the piece of earthenware onto the needle. His sprinkling is not valid, since we cannot be certain that the mechatas fell directly from the esav onto the needle. A person sprinkling mechatas does not have to dip the esav in the mechatas before each sprinkling. He can sprinkle several times after one dipping, because not all the water comes off after one sprinkling. The Mishnah now cites a dispute as to whether this can be assumed to be true in a case where there is reason to suspect that some of the water may have been removed before the first sprinkling. If the mechatas is in a jar with a narrow mouth opening, he may dip the esav into it and take it out in the usual manner when sprinkling. We need not be concerned that most of the mechatas was squeezed off when the esav was pulled through the narrow opening, and what remains is less than the amount needed for sprinkling. Rabbi Yehuda says only the first sprinkling is permitted, i.e., he may sprinkle with it only once after pulling the esav through the narrow opening. Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that pulling it through the narrow opening may remove a lot of the mechatas, so that there is enough left on it for only one sprinkling. Another law regarding dipping the esav in mechatas. If the mechatas was reduced to the point that there was very little water left in the bottom of the jar, it is enough to dip just the tips of the esav stalks in the water and sprinkle, as long as he does not have to wipe the water from the sides or bottom of the jar. The Mishnah discusses the intent a person must have when he sprinkles mechatas. If there were tamei utensils both in front and behind the person sprinkling the mechatas, and he intended to sprinkle the utensils that were in front of him and instead he sprinkled the utensils that were behind him, or if he intended to sprinkle the utensils behind him and instead he sprinkled those that were in front of him, his sprinkling is not valid and the utensils remain tamei. Sprinkling is not valid unless the item is an item that the sprinkler intended to sprinkle. However, if he intended to sprinkle all the utensils that are there in front of them, and he sprinkled the utensils that were to the sides of the area in front of him, i.e. utensils that were not directly in front of him, but off to the side of him, but still in an area that is ahead of him and not behind him, his sprinkling is valid. This is because the sides in front of him are also considered in front of him, and his intention to sprinkle all the utensils in front of him included these utensils as well. We have just learned that the sprinkler must intend to sprinkle an item in order for the sprinkling to make it tahor. The Mishnah now discusses the intent the person being sprinkled must have in order for the sprinkling to be effective. We may sprinkle mechatas on a tamei person with his knowledge or without his knowledge, for example, while he is sleeping. A person who is sprinkled with mechatas becomes tahor even if he did not intend to be sprinkled, and even if he did not know that he was being sprinkled. The Mishnah teaches that many things may be sprinkled together. We may sprinkle on many tamei people or many tamei utensils at the same time, even if there are 100 of them, and it is not necessary to perform a separate act of sprinkling for each one.